But first tonight, the National Cabinet has cut the number of Australian citizens allowed back into the country by half. Only 3,000 people per week are now able to return to their homes.
Obviously, some of the health officials in some of the states were clearly working with their state leaders. Ultimately, the decision is taken because the risk profile does change in terms of having fewer arrivals means there will be fewer positive cases. Now, we would all wish that we weren't facing the changed equation in terms of the Delta variant, but it is there, it is a reality, and we've responded to that reality in terms of maintaining a proposition that has worked to keep Australians safe.
Well, this was a decision the New South Wales Premier Gladys Berejiklian disagreed with.
New South Wales has always done our fair share, and again, the number of people coming home doesn't change the risk. This is a very transmissible variant, the Delta strain as we call it, and I'm disappointed that the other state leaders didn't see fit to maintain the number of Aussies coming back home.
The Australian newspaper has reported that cutting the number of arrivals was the price the Prime Minister had to pay to secure an in-principle agreement from the Premiers for his 4-point plan, his exit strategy, his roadmap out of this COVID debacle. That plan saw him reframe COVID as an infectious disease like any other in our community, something to set up sensible parameters around, but not something to go into lockdown over.
A pathway from a pre-vaccination period which is focused on the suppression of the virus, on community transmission cases, to one that sees us manage COVID-19 as an infectious disease like any other in our community.
Whether the Premiers honour their promise to support Scott Morrison's vision is yet to be seen. Paul Kelly had it right this weekend when he wrote in the Weekend Australian, "Australia has become a short-term, narrow-vision, sectional interest nation. Our public culture," he wrote, "is regressing into a safety-first, protectionist, fortress mindset subservient to the dictates of populist premiers." And Kelly makes the same point that many have made about the AstraZeneca vaccine. It has saved Britain, and the scientist who invented it, Dame Sarah Gilbert, was applauded at Wimbledon. Yet it's been demonised in Australia. And just this week, as you know, the Queensland Health Leadership and Premier Anastasia Palaszczuk trashed the vaccine. And this wasn't even the worst comment or decision the Queensland Premier and her Chief Health Officer have made. In June, they refused to allow a mum who gave birth to her baby prematurely while in quarantine to see her newborn, whisking the child away and depriving it of those vital early bonding time with his mum, that essential human-to-human contact. This is unforgivable. And if I was that mum, I would never forgive Anastasia Palaszczuk for not being able to see my baby in the first week of its life. Another shocking case, a Nine News reporter who had to spend a month in quarantine. She'd flown to the US when her sister died to retrieve her body and pack up her belongings. Heartbreaking. A month in quarantine, grieving her sister without family and friends around her. There is no compassion at all in the Queensland leadership. And now, as a result of this push by the Labor premiers, there will be fewer tickets for Australians trying to get home to say goodbye to loved ones or for precious family moments. And they're also now more expensive. Airlines are being accused of flight gouging, with tickets reportedly as high as $38,000 one way. Australians who've already booked flights are now waiting to hear if their tickets will be cancelled. There's around 34,000 Australians who are unable to get home. And meanwhile, lockdowns around the country and the return of a more contagious COVID variant has created, on the plus side, a massive uptick in vaccination rates. 1 million people got the jab in the past week. Until September, supply of Pfizer is likely to still remain an issue. Joining me now to discuss this is human rights barrister Geoffrey Robertson QC. Thank you so much for your time. Geoffrey,
hello, Sharri.
Good morning. You're in London this morning there for you, of course. What is your reaction to this decision by Australia to halve the number of citizens who can return home? Is this constitutional?
Well, anything is constitutional as far as this government is concerned, and it's got to be brought to book. Unfortunately, we don't have a Human Rights Act to do that. But I've just been dealing with a submission. The government, not the Queensland government, the federal government, has been making to the United Nations, dishonestly telling them that they are reducing, not increasing, the caps, and that they are the kind of cases that you've been dealing with, not getting home to be able to comfort your dying mother, are merely, they say, disagreeable consequences. They're not serious enough to allow you home. And this strikes me as being not just a lack of compassion, but actually inhumane to say that your absence from your dying, from your mother's deathbed is merely disagreeable, is monstrous, really. It is contrary to all human experience, and it is callous. And that is the stance of the Australian government. And as far as expatriates are concerned, there are about 1 million of them, and they've always, in previous elections, they tend to vote for the coalition. But now, I think for the next election, not only will they be going out and voting against it, but their families, their friends, will all be voting against it, because it is, in fact, just cruel, simply cruel, to deny Australians the right. And it is a right. It's an absolute right under the charter that Malcolm Fraser signed up with in 1981. It's an absolute right to return to your native land.
So what's your view of how the federal government should handle this? If it is a human right to return home if you're an Australian citizen, should there be a cap at all? Or do you accept that there does need to be a cap?
No, there should be you should admit Australians who are returning, so long as they've been Pfizered or AstraZeneca, whichever. If they're vaccinated, if they take a test, and if they come home, I suppose home quarantine would be perfectly adequate. It is simply a waste of resources, and it's not decreasing any danger if you allow fully vaccinated Australians who will take tests before they leave and after they arrive to re-enter. That's their right. And of course, they have the consequences of disallowing them are not just disagreeable. They are absolutely traumatic in many cases, where they simply have to get back to either comfort dying relatives or to avoid being arrested and thrown into prison for overstaying their visas in America, for example. That's another consequence that Australia says is merely disagreeable. And of course, there is the whole issue of business. There is many of these young Australians who can't afford $37,000 business class airfares, which are the only way airlines will allow them back, need to get back to accept university courses, to accept jobs, and so forth. So the degree of suffering that this is causing, and of course, it goes back, as we all know, to the monumental disaster last year of the government not ordering Pfizer. I mean, that was colossal stupidity to wait, as Scott Morrison said, look at the other countries. He said that in December, when he should have been taking up the Pfizer order. But that's, I guess, the monumental mistake. And Australia, got to understand, there's this group called the OECD. I don't know what the acronym stands for, but it is a group of the richest, most advanced countries in the world. And there are 37 of them. And where is Australia? We are a member. We're last. We're number 37.
Yes, and it's correct that by the time Australia did the deal with Pfizer, 34 other countries had already signed a deal. We didn't sign it until November, and other countries had signed the deal back in July. So we were very behind. But Geoffrey Robertson,
stupidity.
I'd love to ask you about something else. Are you now considering taking up the legal cases of any other Australians who are trying to get home but who might not be able to afford to do so or haven't been allowed to?
Yes, you've got to understand that this is not, the government admit there are 35,000, 5,000 of whom are vulnerable, and it's never sought to have a Medivac flight. But there are many more. These are just the Australians who are poor, who registered for help. There are tens of thousands of Australians who want to get home under their own steam, whom the government doesn't count and disregards. I took the cases without charge because I felt it was important that this issue be ventilated and that Australia be stopped from causing trauma to its own people. But so they're test cases. They test the government, and we've now seen that
You've said that everyone who has had a vaccine, Pfizer or AstraZeneca, should be allowed home. But the problem is not all of the returning Australians have had a vaccine. And the government's argument, both the premiers and the federal government, is that the reason for now halving the numbers is that the Delta strain is so contagious that the returning citizens pose a health and safety risk. What's your response to this?
Well, my response is that most of those seeking to come home have been vaccinated because the countries they're in have ordered sufficient Pfizer and AstraZeneca to vaccinate them. Britain is about 70% now, and so is America. So it's not a real problem. I'm sure if that were the inducement to get home, they'd all be vaccinated. So it's not the issue. The issue is letting them in, and they're prepared to quarantine, of course, although that's not necessary, and home quarantine or no quarantine could be adequate if they take tests on every second day after arriving, fifth day, and maybe ninth day as well. There's no danger whatsoever, and that's a red herring, really.